Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Rhonda Studnick Kaiser, and I'll be hosting our webinar today. We're going to be talking about the Reboot Conundrum. We are recording today's webinar. If this presents you with any concerns, please drop at this time. You'll be able to access a recording of the event about an hour after we conclude. Simply follow the same registration link that you used to join us, and you'll instead access a recording of the event. You can also share your link with colleagues who might not have been able to join. They'll be presented with a brief registration page, and then we'll be able to access the recording. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout the course of the event today. Just add your question to the chat box and we'll answer in the chat, or we'll feed your question to the presenters. And speaking of presenters, our presenters today, you have me, Director of BigFix Customer Engagement, John Talbert, Director of BigFix Professional Services, Michelle McGough, our BigFix Technical Engagement Manager, and Joe Saylor from our BigFix Accelerated Value Program. So with that, we are today going to dive into restarts and reboots. How do you effectively manage reboots? How do you ensure that your machines are ready for patching when there might be pending reboots? What about post-patching reboots and managing the impacts to end users? We'll share our insights, our best practices. We're going to illustrate this with some real-life examples that we've lived through and worked with our customers to implement. We really hope that this will be a good learning experience for both those new to BigFix and those who need a refresher on the best practices. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Michelle, and maybe Michelle, you can share a real-life experience that you went through in the course of reboots and restarts.
Yeah, it's not a story I'm proud of, but definitely a learning lesson. There was a period where I had left. I used to be at IBM and worked for BigFix and worked for all these customers that were very mature, that had a lot of processes in place, so they were comfortable with restarts, something I took for granted. And I left to go to a company that had recently gone from being a startup to going public, and so they wanted to mature and be like the customers that we had in IBM. And one of the first things that I was assigned to do was to set up a patching program. And I showed up in the change advisory board meeting, the CAB meeting, with a great technical plan. I had all my I's dotted and T's crossed. I had my time. I had my, what are the restart notifications going to look like? When's everything going to get sent out? When are we going to know that we're done? How are we going to know that we're done? I mean, I was sure this was just going to sail right through CAB. It wasn't my first rodeo. Was completely prepared, I thought. But when I got there, I didn't take into account for the fact that organization hadn't been patching. And so they weren't prepared for restarts. They weren't prepared for how the company was going to react to being presented with a request and eventually a forced restart if they let it go for too long. And I got sent out of CAB with my change request denied, and I had to delay my effort and come back. I had to wait till the next CAB session and come back. And it really just goes to show that restarts aren't that technical. I mean, I think Joe and John are going to talk about some technical options that you have. So for those of you that are just looking for that, you're going to get that today. But for anyone new to this type of work, or if you're a business owner, there's a lot more to restarts than just the technical aspect. And we wanted to share that with you.
And it really all just starts with gathering requirements. I think we as engineers are not always really great about really digging into what the requirements are. In your story, it's a great illustration, right? Like your requirement as you knew it, just as you maybe assumed it was I need to patch and I need to restart. That was in your brain. That's what you were designing for. And really, you got to ask way deeper questions than that. Questions that even your customers don't know to begin with. Right? You mentioned determining what success looks like, and that's like something like a very basic thing. And your customers didn't give you that information to begin with. You have to ask them that question. One of the first parts of what success looks like in BigFix is how do we report it? And we have this kind of hidden, not very well advertised toggle in all of our Windows content that fundamentally changes how we report on patches. The default behavior is we the patch becomes non-relevant. In other words, it appears to have been successful the moment that BigFix applies the patch action. So before a reboot happens or anything like that, we've just executed the patch and BigFix will say it was successful, it was applied, because it has been applied technically, right? Like that's if your definition of success is you need to apply the patch, well then that's exactly what you want. If your definition of success is the patch has been applied from Windows perspective, so after the system is rebooted and Windows itself no longer believes it needs a restart, well, you turn this thing on, and this is just a random piece of content. I just kind of want to show you what the setting looks like. This is what all of them in all of the Windows patches have as their final relevance. You'll notice we've got value of setting, Bez client Windows OS, bypass pending restart relevance. If you turn this on, that disables the default behavior. So now the fix will only become non-relevant when you have rebooted the system and Windows is completely patched.
And that's important, right? Because we know that a lot of times a fix isn't really fixed. And especially if you're working with a vulnerability scanner, a fix isn't fully fixed until that reboot has occurred, because maybe there's a registry key that it's looking for, maybe there's a version of a DLL or some sub piece of programming that's in use when you patch, and so it gets released and updated when that reboot occurs. And that's why this piece of the relevance that Joe's highlighting here is really important. Yes, the patch is applied, but are you really safe? And if you scan like with Tenable or Qualys or something like that, has it actually taken place? And a lot of times that doesn't occur until the reboot is finished, right? So there's the patching reporting piece, but there's also what's your definition of done. And if you're working with your security operations team, their definition of done is Tenable or Qualys doesn't show me that this is vulnerable anymore, so a reboot has to happen.
So I'm curious, Michelle, with the CAB and your experience, what did you kind of do to get from, hey, you were denied, to later, I'm sure you got to patching somehow. What did you do there with getting your executive support all lined up? What were kind of the things that you had to battle there?
Yeah, you're actually touching on something that sort of changes how an engineer levels up in an organization. There are some soft skills that we have to develop. And one of those things was I sort of took for granted that, all the executives and business leaders were going to be on board with this. But I had never taken the time to socialize before I went to the change advisory board. I never took the time to socialize with each of the business owners, like the person who owned internal support, desktop support, the people who are going to get, calls and complaints. I didn't notify the executive admin who, has the ear of all the people on, I call it mahogany row, right? All the C-level people. I didn't do that. I didn't go to, I got this assignment from the CISO, but I didn't go back to the CISO and then ask that person for air cover before I even had those conversations. So I really had to go retroactively back and kind of fix that, resolve it. Fortunately, my mistake didn't really go outside of the, until we're talking about it now, but it didn't go outside of the change advisory board. Nobody in there sold me out and said I screwed up or anything. They just said, you got to go back, come back later when you're ready. And I had to go and basically campaign for this program. And it's a maturity that comes in the career. It's a maturity being a program manager, right? Rhonda, you did that for a number of years. And I think you understand that requirement probably better than anybody I know, that technical changes aren't just technical, they're political too. And there's an expectation that we have to set with the people who are affected by it.
It's a really great way to develop some humbleness in your personality. There's no greater way to find out know absolutely nothing at all than getting in front of a change advisory board.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thinking about politics, though, and some of the things that I've encountered, it seems like IT tends to silo itself by end user compute, like your laptops, desktops, things the end users use, and then the server estate tends to be a little bit different. And has like sharply different requirements and approaches to this. Like in server space, you're concerned about maintenance windows and doing things very regimented in a time frame to make sure that we're not disrupting the business. Whereas with the users, it's a little bit more politics of the people as opposed to politics of the organization. And I think the approaches there are very different. At least they have been from my experience. One of the things we did was decouple in the user space, decouple the idea of patching from the idea of rebooting. And part of the reason we did that is we got into some situations where we were, doing the patching and putting the reboot right with the patch. And then somebody would come back from vacation and they get like 3 or 4 reboots in a row on the same day. And that was blowing them up. And we're like, okay, maybe that's not the best way to do it. Maybe if we decouple, we do the patching whenever the patching needs to happen, and then do the reboot at a place where it makes more sense for the end users.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tempting to see the BigFix Take Action interface. We've got post action up on screen right now, and say for your patches, you put a baseline together for the month, as is our best practice, and it's really tempting to attach this restart to every one of those baselines, which is absolutely the most responsive way to do it for the first time. It's the most obvious way to do it for your first baseline, but then you incur all sorts of technical debt by having these reboots out here in your patch baselines. So, a system's been offline for 2 months, been sitting in a drawer, it comes back online and it has to execute both of those baselines, both of which have a reboot on them. And, suddenly you have unpredictable amounts of reboot and you have just pissed your user off even more. I've seen this happen at customers where, 3 years down the line after using BigFix, they had 36 baselines out, and they would end up having, a new system come online and reboot like 12 times. And they kind of like, they ended up pissing people off so much that they would like Google up how to use safe mode and start disabling the BES client. And, using this method, you end up like inadvertently carpet bombing yourself into making your own little black hats in your environment. And it's not a great way to live.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really critical. John, you spoke to that pretty eloquently. In a server space, you are really you're considering uptime. You're considering application availability. You're considering, how often you can actually tolerate reboots. And so as BigFix administrators, you want to talk to your server owners about maintenance windows and what can you do during those maintenance windows and what should they do during those maintenance windows, right? So if they give you every week 4 hours on Saturday, patch me as much as you want, but only on Saturdays for these 4 hours, then you're going to have really happy server administrators and the business is going to be happy because the system's available when people need it to be available. They're current on their patching. They're not delinquent. They're not getting nasty letters from security saying, hey, you're delinquent on your patches. So everybody's happy. I work with one customer who uses our patch policy capability, and they go into their server and they patch primarily servers. So they go into their patching window, they reboot those machines so they have a clean surface to start from, then they patch and they reboot on the way out. So they kind of bookend it with reboots. And everybody's happy because they're killing vulnerabilities, their quality scans are coming up clean, the server and the applications are available, and they're not interrupting server owners at different times to ask for emergency downtime. Perfect use of patch policy, perfect use of those pre and post actions, perfect way to make sure that everything flows appropriately when you have consistent downtimes. There are other server owners who maybe need to reboot in a certain order. So you have another business that they've got dependent servers. So you can patch during that downtime, but they don't want you to reboot because they're going to reboot their systems in the order they need them to come back up in. So having those conversations with the business is really important. Yes, we're pushing buttons that are doing restarts, but we need to know what the business needs both from the security perspective, but from the operations perspective. HR people need to have their HR stuff available. We can't reboot financial systems at the end of the quarter. Those are things that you need to work with you can't be myopic even if you're a BigFix administrator and not understand what the business requirements are. And then when you're talking about users, that's an entirely different story, right? Because you want people to want to be patched. And the surest way to have people not want to be patched and do what Joe said is to interrupt them on a regular basis. So in those cases, I do agree that decoupling the reboots from the rest of the patching process is fine, because you can do a lot of patching in the background. You don't have to close things down. You can run things in the background, and then you just need to work and communicate with your end users about, hey, we're going to reboot you maybe once a week. It's the cleanest, nicest thing for your system. It's going to make your system really healthy. It's the cleanest, nicest thing from security. And if you reboot your system on your own, like every Friday night, you reboot and you go home, then on Monday morning, you'll never run into a forced reboot because you've always rebooted. Now, there's emergency patching situations, and in those cases, you're going to reboot people and it's just going to suck. But if you communicate, you send out a big email or you put something up on your homepage, internally to your company and say, hey, we've got this emergency patch situation. Please please accept the reboot and get this done. It's going to make you more popular, and you're not going to have death threats, and you're not literally not going to have death threats. Some people get really upset about things like that when they think that they deserve full autonomy on their systems. So those are kind of some of the best practices I can communicate about.
We have a question in place, and I think it's a perfect time to bring this one up, and it's on the single versus multiple reboots item. The question is around, doesn't it depend on the type of patch? His understanding is that if a patch is touching the OS kernel, it'll need a reboot. Then you should reboot that before trying to apply another patch that further modifies the kernel. And I think I think, Joe, you mentioned you've seen cases where you need to do multiple reboots to get a certain patch to apply. Joe, you had a comment there?
Yeah, absolutely. So multiple reboots are the bane of everybody's existence. The first thing you want to do anytime you run into that situation is find out if there is a way to not do multiple reboots. I've had a couple of examples recently where it seemed like we needed multiple reboots, like the Visual Studio patches. If the Visual Studio is currently running, you can kind of only apply them sequentially. And so it seemed like it needed multiple reboots, when the real answer was, if Visual Studio is closed, then it will take the latest patch and apply everything, like all the cumulatives before it. So doing a little bit of research like that, Windows patches especially are vulnerable is not the right word, are susceptible to multiple reboots if you apply the servicing stack patch that typically comes out monthly second, then it will need multiple reboots. So just doing as much research as you can to prevent that situation is the first key. We've been talking about politics a lot, where you need to make users be on your side and be on board with your reboot policy, and being as frugal as possible is what gets you there.
Yeah, there's an element there that I wanted to go back and touch on, and that's the OS portion. With non-Windows, we tend to see reboots needed a lot less than in the Windows space, and it is a in-use, file in use type of thing. So I know in server space, kind of doing the pre-patching reboot is a really strong way to knock down anything that might interfere with the patch applying. I've never used that in like user space though. I wonder does that make sense, doing that sort of preemptive pre-patch reboot and then a reboot after in user space, or is that too much?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to piss people off. just as a rule, doing a pre-reboot then a post-reboot. I think the stronger way is to, and I really kind of think this is where end user security is going. Like, this is the next frontier, is kind of gamification of your end user security, like getting the users on board to like making use of your policy and being proactive about it is where I believe all this is going. Rhonda mentioned this idea of changing your policy based on when the last time the user rebooted was. So on screen here, I got a couple of fixlets. They're pretty basic in terms of their details for their relevance. This one is just if you have been up less than 6 days, really less than 7 days, because it's equal to or less than 6 days, and you have not opted out, which by the way, this is a fantastic thing that you should really build into your reboots. So anytime you have a policy action, make some sort of kind of obfuscated client setting or registry key that your technicians can use to just opt out of the reboots. Like if something goes wild, you want a way out that doesn't involve modifying all endpoints or changing your policies. So now that we've split our reboot actions out into these different time periods, this first one, if the user is rebooted within the last 7 days, like we should definitely not force the reboot on them at all, because we want them to be incentivized. Every reboot, negative reinforcement isn't a thing anyone wants to experience, and a reboot of your system is negative reinforcement.
Reinforcement, yeah.
Yeah, and so we want to find ways to sneak some positive reinforcement in there. Users will feel a little bit empowered if they're allowed to cancel the reboot and if they know why, right? So when this notification pops up, if we in our message say, something like, good job, you've booted recently, cancel away, and then we allow them to cancel the action, then they will have, they'll get this feedback that, hey, I rebooted recently, I should do that more often, because then I get this nice little warm fuzzy feeling.
Yeah.
So one thing, can you go back to the prior, oh, there we go. The warm fuzzy.
Yeah. Oh, that was a previous warm fuzzy. Oops. Yeah.
Could you go back to the action script on that before? Because I wanted to point out one of the things in the relevance that you're doing that's interesting that I want us to expand out later in the webinar, and that is instead of using pending reboot, you're using uptime, right, as a thing, so that we're less dependent on that pending restart inspector there. And I know maybe we want to pivot into that, because there was actually a question on that as well. The pending restart and kind of the nuances and complications there.
Yeah, of course. What's the question? Specific question, anyway.
Yeah, so very interested in deep diving more into pending restart actions. Found more and more we need a few rounds of patch and reboot. SQL Server is often a culprit there. But I wanted to touch on the pending file rename operations piece and that piece of the technical portion, since we seem to be driving some interest there.
Yeah, of course. So there are, let's bring up the analysis first. So there's a couple of things that happen when the BES client tells itself it needs to have a restart, right? Let's go back to our patch action. So when the patch executes, we get in the action script this line here, action requires restart. That's what tells the client that this particular action needs a restart and that the client as a whole needs a restart. When this fires off, we get a registry key inside our BigFix Enterprise Client BES pending restart node, and it'll have whatever that string was in here as a value. So that's how the client knows this particular action caused a restart and still requires one. When the system restarts, it will check a few other registry keys when the client comes up for whether it's allowed to clear these pending restart flags. The main one is pending file rename operations. This is a Windows key that isn't OS specific, so stuff other than Windows patches will use it, but it's how Windows tells itself that a file needs to be either renamed or moved or deleted that is currently in use. So, stuff like anything in the Windows System 32 folder will typically need an entry here in order to be updated after the patch. So a really important key, and this is how one of the ways the client decides whether it should not clear the pending restart flag. One of the issues with it is that there are quite a few applications, typically stuff like antivirus is a common one, and the Windows print spooler, for whatever reason, is another one, that are really aggressive about putting new entries into that key. Like they will put it up the millisecond your operating system boots, and then typically our BES client will be set to delayed start, and there will already be stuff in here, and it will think it still needs a reboot. There are a few other keys as well that the client pays attention to that are Windows patch specific. There's a bunch of ways Windows tells itself that a given patch needs a reboot, and we take a look at those as well. So that's the mechanics behind it. The good news is we can do some stuff about it. So there is this key. I've got it on this fixlet right here. Sorry, client setting, not a key. Also a key, but a special kind of one. So this pending restart exclusions key allows you to set a list of stuff for the client to ignore. So if you want to be very specific about it and exact in your environment, you can use an analysis I'll show you in a second to determine what's sticking around in that key in your environment. And then you use this client setting to say, okay, I want to exclude anything that says spool and anything that says McAfee in its path, right? And then you can make it very, very exact in that way. One thing that we've been doing a lot more frequently that a lot of customers have begun adopting is to just ignore it altogether. This value in this fixlet right here, just colon, semicolon, tells the client to ignore this key entirely because every path is going to have a colon in it. And generally speaking, it's not a problem. Like it sounds worse than it is. It sounds like you're giving up more functionality than you really are. For Windows patch specific stuff, there's not really any loss of fidelity because we have all these other keys that Windows uses to tell us about patches. For stuff that is non-Windows, there's maybe a little more of a hole in using this. If you try to install, I don't know, an Oracle patch and it adds some stuff in pending restart exclusions, and you depend on that to determine whether it, still needs a reboot after a reboot or not, right? Like it's possible to lose some fidelity here, but in all of our default content, you really don't lose anything.
Yeah, and I've actually seen this in practice, and it saved so much time because one of the key problems with this is that sometimes patches aren't relevant if a machine is pending a restart, and so you can't even apply patches. Like it just doesn't, it won't go down, from a relevance perspective. So this was really critical in my situation to ignore that, so that we actually got patches going out the door. So that was important.
And this really comes back to, treating your users nicely. Like if your computer is pending restart and we have this policy action out here that, reboots it every time it's in a reboot window, you'll get a lot of unnecessary reboots because, you had, again, your antivirus application just tossing something in pending restart exclusions, and then you just need another reboot for like no effective reason. And again, being frugal will help your users trust you with restarts.
And Joe, that analysis that you were showing us earlier,
yes,
this is the place. These are the places that BigFix looks to determine if there is a pending restart. So, and this is out on bigfix.me. So we can put that link out in the chat for you, or we'll throw it out into the forum. But this is a great analysis for you to use to understand what's in there. Joe, you can show us the multiple things today.
I don't know why it works. Oh no, there it goes. Anyway, so you can see some of the results here. This is what's in my pending rename file operations key on this box. You can see it's a bunch of Windows print spooler stuff. So yeah. I would have to exclude this if I wanted, my reboots to be detected well. And I currently have nothing in the Windows keys. So, my system has actually applied all the patches. So it may have, stuck in pending restart, even though it was clean from a patch perspective.
Yeah.
Nice. So Joe, two quick things. So one, could you go back to the description and grab that bigfix.me link right out of there and paste it into the chat, because in the chat, it'll be clickable for everybody who's watching. And then I did want to go back, being friendly to the users and going all the way back to the CAB conversation and the kind of getting there. We don't have regimented therapeutic weekly reboots, and we do. And part of the process, I think, that we didn't talk about is that initial, what do you have to do to get that set up? And I think there's a part where you interact with your help desk. I think there's a part that you interact with your users with a communication. For example, like emailing out a campaign before the first week that you do this. Send an email a month out. Hey, we're going to institute Friday with reboots. If you're still working at Friday 8 p.m., you should take a break and go get dinner and save your work before you do, because your computer's going to get rebooted starting on April 1st. And maybe not April 1st, because they'll think it's a joke. June 1st, let's start on June 1st, right? And then, a week out, send a follow-up email, and the day before, send another follow-up email, and, make it be from your IT org so they know it's coming ahead of time. And for the people who don't read that stuff from their IT org, because you've set up that mail rule, having something in the message itself, I think, is very important. When we did ours years and years and years ago, our message said, hey, this is company name, blah, 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 IT. This is your weekly Friday reboot. It's going to come every Friday. If there's a problem with this thing, please contact the help desk at the normal number. And we actually put the number in the message as well, just to demonstrate to the end user. So this wasn't some external entity doing something on their computer. This was their IT org, and we knew a bunch of things about their IT org to promote that feeling of, we're legitimately doing this, and this is not hostile.
Yeah, I mean, generating trust is the way, right? Like that's the primary thing you need to do. You can almost treat this idea of an email notification as well as our BigFix notifications as kind of a de facto multi-factor authentication. So, you send out this email to your users. Ideally, you have, some customizations in place, like with the self-service application. You'll notice I got this like gold bar up here, so you can change it to your company colors. You can change the name of the application to match your company so that it engenders a little more trust. And then in that first email, include a screenshot of your notification. Like, I would want to just take a screenshot of this, of exactly what my notification is going to be, and include it in that first email. And so now we have like this feedback loop of trust where a user knows that this is coming from a trusted source, and they're not likely to, panic, hit cancel, and call the help desk and the police and whoever.
Yeah, and also having, like a countdown, not a countdown timer, but kind of a countdown timer, like how long can they snooze it? How often can they snooze it? And when is their, like, no, the bomb's going to go off, so to speak, and you're going to be rebooted? Because there are legitimate times you're in the middle of doing something, it's not okay for you to immediately reboot. So that is also, part of what that goes into that. And I think the biggest thing too about reboots and restarts, especially when you're thinking in the end user context, is, what is your company's tolerance to end user interruptions? Some companies have zero tolerance, so they're going to only patch once a month, reboot once a month with the baseline. They don't care, because they want their users to be, the least interruption possible. Whereas other companies are going to do some silent patching in the background, or they're going to put, I love offers for this. It kind of goes hand in hand with reboots. If you, when you generate your actions, also generate an offer, then the customer will see, similar to what Joe's showing here, they'll see that they've got these patches pending, and so they can go in and close everything down. I loved that. I would close everything down and I would go and accept all the offers and say reboot, and then I would be done. So I was in control. I would, go to lunch and I would get all the things. You're still going to occasionally have those 2 reboot patches, or something gets stuck, or and you're going to get that MS24 that I've seen that thing and it's been applied 15 times, and that's when you direct them to the help desk, and the help desk helps them figure out why that patch isn't actually applying. So having a good relationship with your help desk, having a good relationship and process around that is also going to be really helpful. But it is up to the organization to say how often they tolerate interrupting their users, and that's important. We even have one customer that we worked with who they use a baseline, and they have a specific kind of like a special thing that comes up and says, you need to close PowerPoint and Outlook and this, so that we can go ahead and patch you so it's even more friendly. Like, it's something that we help them develop that's even extra on top of just what we have out of the box. So
yeah, I mean, user control is so important to allowing people to get on board with your plan for reboots. It also allows users to see when things go wrong. We talked about the pending file rename exclusions key quite a bit. When we have false positives for pending restarts, like you can get by leaving the default behavior there, it really causes users to not think there's a problem when they have to reboot like 2 or 3 or 4 times. When really, in an ideal world, if you have 3 reboots, something has probably gone wrong. Your user is probably vulnerable to whatever you're trying to patch. You want them to call the help desk at that point. Whereas if you haven't been super clean with your reboot strategy up until then, they may not think anything of it, right? They may just be unpatched and go along with their life.
Michelle or Joe, do you have any examples of customers that you've worked with, or things that you've done in your space where they're monitoring for, excessive reboots or excessive machines with pending restarts, from a troubleshooting perspective, where you may be running into a patch that's not applying appropriately? Any best practices there that you wanted to share?
As an engineer, no, I think, it's been some years since I've done that. But as a product manager, which is what I was doing more recently, there was a use case that came in from a partner, and it was the partner suggested it, where they could go through either a list of things from a SIM, or they could go through some things from other analytics and basically use that to create tickets. And, BigFix does integrate with ServiceNow. So this is something that you could do if you wanted to create some kind of an alert or something to let a technical person know. I don't know if they'd be desktop or help desk. I think that's going to vary depending on the company. To let them know that there is an issue and to proactively reach out to that user to troubleshoot it, instead of waiting it for them to get more annoyed or for it to get worse. Yeah, that's a pretty cool use case, and it probably wouldn't be that complicated to configure, actually. Not to create a ticket or an email alert.
Yeah. What about you, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, generally we do this by monitoring action results. Web Reports has some great built-in functionality there. You just in the Web Reports Explore Data category under actions, you just check on success rates. Pending restart. If you have like a bunch of boxes still in pending restart, like a day after you've deployed the Patch Tuesday patches, it's probably not a big deal, right? Like, I wouldn't worry at that point. If you are 6 days past and you have 90% of boxes sitting in pending restart, well, then probably something has gone terribly wrong. Same deal with checking out failures. If a bunch of boxes have reported failed for a given fixlet, that's a super easy way to see exactly what's going on with your just overall success rates. And then once you notice a trend that isn't quite right, you just click through to the action and see why.
Yeah.
So can I ask, because I'm interested in that, I think that's a cool use case. Is there a way to set that up so you got a report that will auto-generate when it's finding these, or do we have to always go and check?
Yeah, I wish I had a demo set up for this already. But yeah, I mean, Web Reports has a like pretty robust email system built into it. Once you configure email in Web Reports, you can set up this action report and then just have it emailed to you like once a day or once every couple of days or whatever your schedule is. It's all, you know, very, very quickly configurable inside of Web Reports.
Yeah, in Web Reports, there's actually the session relevance trigger, so you could have it trigger only when it exceeds some thresholds if you want to get that fancy about it.
Yeah, see, I like that. So you'd only really there'd be more signal.
Less noise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Much more.
Yeah.
Less noise, more signal. A curious question. So when we did our rollout of end user reboots and the therapeutic reboot, the first week was a nightmare, and the help desk got calls, but we had the script, so they knew what was going on, and by the second week it was like almost no noise. And by the end of the first month, nobody even noticed them anymore. So it really worked. There was short-term pain, long-term gain. One of the things that we did there, though, was we added in a flag to our policy actions that allowed us to set an opt-out thing, so that if we got something that was a legitimate, we shouldn't be rebooting this box with the regular thing, we could opt them out of the whole program with a single, we used a client setting. But Rhonda, I wonder if in your neck of the woods, did you use that?
No, we didn't. It would have been really elegant. But it is a really elegant solution to do something like that. But we did definitely have like certain categories of users that, you know, like we didn't target executive staff. So you know, certain key levels of people that, you know, and generally those people also, at least in the situation I was in, they had some more you know, some technical people that worked on their machines, and oftentimes they had more than one machine for various reasons, you know, one for travel and one for work or whatever. And so those people were the people that we talked to when they were out of compliance. We would talk to those people and they would handle that, but those people weren't subject to our weekly reboot. You know, and that weekly reboot really was it was something that came down from the CISO, along with a lot more expedited patching. You know, and this was many years ago. You know, the trend of more and more vulnerabilities and more things coming more and more quickly, more and more fixlets, more and more content that you have to pay attention to. You know, we live today with, you know, not just the Microsoft patch content, but then the out-of-band Microsoft patch content, and then SysAkev, and then whatever else is blowing up in the environment. You know, we live in an environment where we have to look at security on a regular basis, and reboots are an unavoidable consequence of that. So the more that you can patch silently, the more that you can, you know, rely on user reboots, the more that you can, you know, you just become much more effective at your patching process. And using things like patch policy, where you're not having to look and look for patches to deploy, but using something like patch policy, which is refreshing on a regular basis and then pushing those things out as a good option. So.
Yeah, and I like that the therapeutic, it's still in the user space, that the therapeutic reboot works well with the patch policy things, because patch policy can queue up, hey, you're missing, you know, 3 months of patches on this machine that you just pulled out of a closet, and still get that therapeutic reboot at the end of the week to take care of sealing and the freshness. And in the rare cases where multiple reboot might be needed and something doesn't become relevant until after that first reboot, you're going to catch them the next week anyway. So the exposure window really doesn't outweigh, depending on risk tolerance, of course, but doesn't outweigh the inconvenience part of it.
Yeah, and speaking of risk tolerance, is it worse to have your system vulnerable to the latest exploit for an extra week, or is it worse to encourage your user to find ways around your reboot scheme? Like which of those things is really more risky? It's just a really, really important thing to consider. Patch policies is a great thing to bring up here, because we've been talking about decoupling your reboot windows, and patch policies really exemplifies that, because you can have oftentimes multiple policies. It's very common to have like your Windows OS stuff and your .NET patches in separate policies, in separate schedules, applied to the same target. And so if you have your reboot on the policy, then every time those patches come up, it's going to reboot twice. And so decoupling it for patch policies is super, super important. But then you look at the other side of it with server automation, which is, a system designed to very precisely, sequentially do reboots and other actions, on like a set of disparate endpoints. It's the exact opposite. So that's the one spot where decoupling reboot windows doesn't make a lot of sense, because you'll often have, you'll be working on a SQL cluster, you have to patch node A, and it has to stop its SQL services, do the patch, restart, come back online. And then you have to do node B, it has to do the same thing, stop, patch, reboot. And if that happens in any other order, then you just blew everything up and now you have a massive downtime. So, in that case, like that's where the decoupling reboot stuff just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Well, fortunately, with server automation, there's a place to put it into the plan, so it can be very regimented like that. So I feel like that's a great kind of alternate use case to what we've been focusing on a lot in this call, which is more the end user space. But yeah, the automation, I think, covers that nicely, server automation.
Okay, so I think we've waxed poetic for a while now. What was the one thing you were thinking of, John? Because I knew there's always one more thing.
There is one more thing, and that is something that was mentioned early on as part of the question. I don't think we talked through all the way, and that's the pending restart, or the restart needed fixlet itself. Right? Because I know back when I was doing ops, we used this to kind of do reporting on, hey, what needs a restart? And as Joe, as you led us through, there's a whole bunch of what ifs and edge cases around showing whether a restart is needed or not. So I like the idea that we're using uptime as a complement to it and not just using the restart needed itself. Joe, I can see on your face. Go ahead.
I'm just waiting for a hole here. Yeah, so I mean, these three actions these three fixlets up at the top of my screen here are, I have them in a separate site right now, but these are actually the ones that exist in BES support. So, everybody has these. They're pretty basic, and there's a little bit of difference between each of them. I think the name more or less describes what happens inside. If you've kind of paid attention to the pending restart and pending rename file operations key discussion earlier. So the first one here, restart needed, all that does is check the relevance pending restart. So for any reason, there's no delineation between any kind of register key or anything like that here. This one will become relevant. And so these other two are kind of subsets of it. So you can figure out, hey, do I need a restart because I have stuff in the BES pending restart key? Or do I have it, do I need a restart because of some other keys inside of like the run services key or anything like that?
I think that's all I had as far as points I wanted to make sure that we loop back around to. Anybody else have closing thoughts?
Yeah,
this is the time for last minute questions from our audience. So get your last minute questions in.
I just want to mention we did touch on parameters, but we didn't have time to go into that. We did talk about that in last month's webinar when we talked about PowerShell. There was some time spent on parameters. Joe showed a parameter that he created, a custom one. And if that's something you'd like to do and you want to know more, hit us up in the forum, because there was a good conversation about this last month.
Yeah, parameterization is great. Everybody should be familiar with it. The one other thing you mentioned earlier, John, about help desk scripting, I think we kind of glossed over a little bit, but that's a real key component of keeping your call time low, like we've talked a lot about keeping your call volume low. Like all of managing restarts is really about preventing your customers from calling in to the help desk, right? We want to minimize that number as much as possible, but getting good scripting and good troubleshooting materials available to your help desk is the other side of that. If a user does call in for a 4 or 5 reboot situation, you want your help desk to be prepared to understand and get that user through it without spending 2 hours, right? You want their call time to be like 10 minutes instead of 100 minutes. So giving them tools like this, if possible, if they have access to the console or other BigFix data, giving them access to these 3 fixlets will help narrow down the scope of where the restart problem is. Giving them access to the results of the pending restart detection analysis will help them to dig down before the user even has to give them any data. Will help them dig down and determine why exactly these things are going on. So help desk tooling is another side to this that will help reduce your time cost multipliers.
Great point. All right, any new questions?
Did y'all see the comment from Rob in the questions panel? It looks like it's been answered, but I didn't respond to it. Otherwise, I can read it out. What Rob said is more a comment than a question. For the restart fixlets, another option available is to still use the pending restart inspector, then add additional relevance like exist key, and then put the path to the reboot required of native registry. Did we touch on that already? Because I think I missed it if we did.
Yeah, I mean, we showed it a little bit. I don't know that we explicitly talked about that, but in these 3 fixlets I have here, kind of the demo ones, you can see that in play. I've started out with pending restart, so this fixlet will just never be relevant unless the client thinks it needs a restart. So if that's just step number 1, and then we move on to additional conditionals after that. If my uptime is less than 7 days, then this one will become relevant. And if it is also not opted out with my secret technique here, then it will also not be relevant. So I mean, starting off with all of your assumptions in the relevance is always a good thing. I did kind of bad here by not also including maybe operating system is Windows, right? That's another conditional here. Maybe you would want to include, or we would maybe also want to include, if my OS type is client, right? Maybe I only want this one to be relevant to client workstations and not server workstations.
We have just a few minutes left. I did want to, I think, we've really spent most of our time today in the context of Windows. And I think Windows is kind of the place where the pending restarts, and it is kind of the bane of everyone's existence. Certainly was part of mine. But are there any quick things that we can talk about in the non-Windows space, either Linux or Mac, that we maybe want to touch on really quickly?
I feel like non-Windows machines are legendary for their uptime. There was a story about I think it was one of the colleges had a server that accidentally they closed up a closet and was remodeling, and that server was running for 20 years in the closet without a reboot. So it's still running and kicking and doing just fine. So I think it is more of a Windows space. If we're in the Linux non-server space, server automation is going to take care of that anyway. So I think we've covered that. I don't think there's any nuances there. And in the end user space, I think Mac, there was a question about Mac that was answered in the chat. And I don't think it's that much different with Mac. And if you're running say a GUI and running Linux on workspace, it's going to be very similar to the server space in that if you're not patching the kernel, it probably doesn't need a reboot anyway. And if you are patching the kernel, then it definitely does. And then all the prior applies, and we'll pick it up with that reboot needed cycle OS uptime because we're using uptime there instead of the pending restart so much. So I think, unless, Joe, you have any other non-Windows things you want to think, or Michelle?
No, Linux is amazing. You don't need to reboot.
There you go.
Turn on the page. You don't need to worry about anything else.
Awesome. All right. Well, then let's go ahead and wrap up for today. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Joe, John, Michelle, for being part of the panel today. As mentioned, we did record the webinar today. I apologize. I got a little frog in my throat, so apologies for my voice at the moment. We did record today's webinar. That will be available in about an hour. You just simply use the same link that you used to get here to go to that recording. And you can also, as I said, share your link with colleagues who weren't able to attend so that they're able to watch this as well. If you have follow-up questions, you can throw them onto the BigFix forum. Just go to the events category and throw your questions out there. We'll be monitoring for any other questions that you might have, or if we missed something that you thought was really important, but hopefully we covered most of it. And thanks to all for being here today. Have a great rest of your day.